A man has only so much knowledge as he puts to work, commented St. Francis of Assisi, perhaps the most famous of Catholic saints. And that comment reminds me of a very famous autobiography, one I mentioned in my last program. The book is entitled The Education of Henry Adams, and it was written by Harvard professor and historian Henry Adams. And in his autobiography, he sets himself the task of trying to determine which parts of his education had been useful and which parts had not been particularly useful. Which brings me to the theme of this series of programs I'm doing. The theme is, what are the most important things we can learn in life? This is part 2 of the series. And in this series, what I'll attempt to do is to tell you what so many famous thinkers in philosophy and psychology and religion and literature have said in response to the question, what are the most important things we can learn in life? Allow me to provide a brief review of some of the points I made in segment 1 of this series. I talked briefly about the most obvious kinds of important learnings, and I didn't spend much time talking about them because they are obvious. I alluded to learning how to read well, write well, compute, and also cultivate job skills. But I also indicated that a satisfying life requires more than a good job. A satisfying life requires wisdom. At least according to the great thinkers, it requires wisdom. And what is wisdom? Wisdom is an understanding of what is true and what is not true. That so often in life we experience problems because of illusions we have, mistaken ideas we have, and that if we could determine the truth, perhaps we would suffer less in life and perhaps we would experience more joy. And in the first program I gave an example of this. In response to the question, what is true or false, I raised the issue of what is the best path to happiness. What is the best path to happiness? One view has it that the best path involves habitually amusing ourselves, lots of shopping, and gaining the approval of almost everybody we know. Is that true or false? Is that an appropriate path to greater happiness? Well, there is another viewpoint, and that viewpoint emphasizes learning, understanding, moving to higher levels of consciousness, of awareness, and also virtue, trying to be a decent human being, and also meaningful activity often involving service to others. It's been said by many thinkers that happiness is a byproduct of meaningful activity. Again, wisdom is understanding what is true. George Santayana, very famous Spaniard who became an American and taught at Columbia University, said something that I think summarizes this idea quite well. Santayana said, wisdom comes by disillusionment. Wisdom comes by disillusionment. The idea is that as we grow older, we can become free of illusions, of mistaken ideas we had, and in so doing, achieve greater wisdom. Perhaps one of the most important questions each of us must answer in life is whether we will habitually face reality or whether we will habitually avoid facing reality. I don't doubt that a little escapism may be a good thing, but the great thinkers in general claim that it's very important, if we wish to lead more satisfying lives, that we try to face reality, even though reality can be very painful at times. And I think an illustration of the advantages of facing reality concerns people who have problems with alcohol, alcoholics, and people who are addicted to other drugs. I think it's accurate to say that the reason many go into rehabilitation is they feel that their attempts to escape reality through alcohol, through other drugs, doesn't make them feel nearly as good as being sober. That again, with all of the problems facing reality involves, it's still better than trying to habitually escape reality. It's a better way to live. Let's continue a search for truth. What I would like to do is to pick up on the issue of morality and its connection to happiness. There are some people who claim, rightly or wrongly, that there is a connection between being moral and experiencing greater happiness. Other people deny the connection. Let's examine at least two different viewpoints on this. Leo DeRocha was the manager of the New York Giants many, many years ago, and he became famous for a particular comment that he made. Actually, he became famous for many reasons, but this is perhaps the most famous comment he ever expressed. He said this baseball manager said, "Nice guys finish last." There are people who believe that dishonorable people in business, in politics, and education are more likely to advance their careers than honorable people, and as a consequence experience more happiness in life. One viewpoint has it that dishonorable people laugh all the way to the bank. And also, we have heard the expression that no good deed goes unpunished. No good deed goes unpunished. So this viewpoint, in essence, is saying there really isn't a connection between being a decent human being and experiencing more happiness. True or false? Well, let me give you another viewpoint. And this viewpoint, I think, is summarized quite well in a French proverb. And the proverb is this: "The softest pillow is a clear conscience." The idea is that in the long run, and those are the important words, in the long run, honorable people will experience more joy, and that honorable people experience a more pleasant old age, that as they get closer to death, it's easier for honorable people to face death than dishonorable people, and therefore can experience more tranquility in their old age. The philosopher Montaigne put it this way. He said, and I'm quoting Montaigne, "A generous pride accompanies a good conscience." I think the $64 question in life actually is whether there is a connection between morality and happiness. Each person, of course, must decide for himself, but I don't think it's a question any of us can avoid. There is a third viewpoint, by the way, at least a third viewpoint, and that viewpoint was expressed by philosopher, medical doctor Albert Schweitzer. Schweitzer, who as a doctor in French Equatorial Africa treated the poorest of the poor, said that we have a duty to be decent. We have a duty to be moral, whether it makes us happy or not. Well, what have the great thinkers said about the connection between morality and increased happiness? I've given several viewpoints. Well, the list of philosophers and other famous thinkers who claim that being moral will make us happier is a very long list. And let me start first with a comment from Marcus Aurelius, a very famous Stoic philosopher who also, incidentally, was a famous Roman emperor. And Marcus Aurelius, in his very famous self-help book called Meditations, this perhaps is the oldest self-help book. It was written about 2,000 years ago. Marcus Aurelius said this. He said, "Know the joy of life by piling good deed on good deed until no rift or cranny appears between them." Among the other great thinkers, and this is a partial list, who claim that we will experience more joy and more tranquility in life if we try to be decent, are the following: Buddha, Confucius, Mencius, another famous Chinese philosopher, Plato and Aristotle, Jesus, Hillel, famous Jewish rabbi, Muhammad, founder of Islam, the philosophers Kant and Spinoza. In fact, Spinoza equated virtue with intelligence. He believed that when we act decently, fairly, justly, we're acting intelligently. And when we don't act decently and fairly, we're acting unintelligently. which raises the question, when people compute other people's IQs, which generally is not done very much today because the IQ test has pretty much been discredited. But in any event, if Spinoza is correct, if the desire to be virtuous is a species of intelligence, should we subtract points from a person's IQ if they don't get it, if they don't see that there is a connection? Again, continuing with this list of great thinkers who claim that being a good person will make our lives better: Emerson, Thoreau, Bertrand Russell, an atheist, and Tolstoy, perhaps the greatest novelist who ever lived. And again, I remind you, that's just a very partial list of thinkers who have seen this connection. I must again emphasize that they claim that in the long run, being virtuous will lead us to greater happiness. They don't deny that at times we can be punished for our good deeds, for our evil. And the question I'm raising now is, can they all be wrong about this connection they saw? Seneca, another famous Stoic philosopher, put it this way. He said that in the long run, honesty and justice and kindness bring us more happiness than ever comes from the pursuit of pleasure. Seneca was not against people pursuing pleasure, but he did believe that virtue, in the long run, brings us more satisfaction in living than does a pursuit of pleasure. And there is a very famous holy book that addresses this question in as sound a way, in as lucid a way as any book I know of. The name of the book is the Dhammapada. The Dhammapada. It is a Buddhist scripture, Buddhist holy book, perhaps the most famous of Buddhist holy books. And in this Buddhist scripture, it indicates that when a person does evil, at first it can taste sweet, but eventually the taste changes from sweetness to bitterness. Also, the Dhammapada expresses the idea, which I think we are all familiar with, that what goes around comes around. The idea being that if we hurt someone, we in the long run will be hurt by our action. And let me give you two very brief quotes from this holy book, the Dhammapada, which illustrate the points I've made. This particular sentence concerns the idea of what goes around comes around. But as dust thrown against the wind, mischief is blown back in the face of the fool who wrongs the pure and harmless. By the way, the Buddha does regard to people who are lacking in the desire to be virtuous as fools. And another sentence or two. For a while the fool's mischief tastes sweet, sweet as honey, but in the end it turns bitter, and how bitterly he suffers. What's Jesus' take on this subject? Well, in Matthew 16, Jesus says the following, and my guess is that many of you are familiar with this quote. Jesus says, "For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life?" And earlier in Matthew 10, Jesus apparently indicates that inner peace may come only after moral struggle. Again, Matthew 10, inner peace may come only after moral struggle. Let me continue this search for truth, determination of what is true and false, moving to another aspect of our daily lives. And that is there a connection between our anxiety, our stress level, and our desires? What is the best way to deal with anxiety? What is the best way to deal with stress? Well, let me give you a couple of viewpoints, and you can determine for yourself which one you think is true. One viewpoint has it that trying to satisfy our desires for a lot of money, status, power, expensive possessions is likely to reduce our anxiety and stress levels. The idea is go for it. Increase those desires if need be for money, status, and power and expensive possessions, because in the long run they will reduce our anxieties. That's one viewpoint. There is another viewpoint, which is represented by many philosophers and religionists, and that is that the best way to reduce our anxiety, believe it or not, is to reduce our desires. It's the message of many famous thinkers. The Buddhists claim that we suffer from our desires. And Lao Tzu, very famous Chinese thinker, who is considered to be the founder of a school of philosophy known as Taoism, Lao Tzu said, "To be content is to be rich. To be content is to be rich." And if one wants to be content, Lao Tzu maintained, one should reduce one's desires. Now you may ask, why care about what's true or false? Why care about what's true or false? Well, so many of the great thinkers said we should be very concerned about this because it's possible that we suffer from our illusions and ignorance. In fact, so many of the great thinkers have claimed that we do suffer. We do suffer from our illusions and our ignorance. They claim that ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance is not bliss. Let me give some examples from contemporary life. Examples concerning the advertising industry, TV, movies, and the music industry. And let me pose some what-ifs. What if the advertising, TV, movie, and music industries almost always present a false picture of the good life, but we believe it to be a true picture of the good life? What if these industries almost always provide, in one way or another, bad advice about how to live a satisfying life, and we think it's good advice? Is it possible that learning what is true is similar to waking up? I think it's fair to say that by middle age, many of us have been disabused of certain illusions we had when we were younger. But as Schopenhauer contends, it's probably true that until the day we die, we will still be quite ignorant in certain ways. We'll still have certain blind spots about reality. But this idea of seeing what is true being akin to waking up is illustrated by the Buddha's name, the Buddha. That word literally means the one who waked up. Legend has it that it took the Buddha many years to go from a state of ignorance to a state of enlightenment. And by enlightenment, the Buddha means more tranquility and more joy. A very significant question, if determining what is true and false about our daily lives is important, is how do we determine what is true? How does one determine what is true? Well, Ralph Waldo Emerson and others suggest that one of the things we should habitually do is to evaluate our experiences. Emerson put it this way. He said, "A strange process, that by which experience is converted into thought. The manufacture goes forward at all hours." Psychiatrist M. Scott Peck has emphasized that if we want to move to a greater appreciation of truth, that we should be skeptical, that skepticism is an important attitude. And psychiatrist Speck says this. He says that it's essential, it is essential for our spiritual growth, that we all become scientists who are skeptical about the common assumptions of our culture. Which brings me to B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner was a very famous professor of psychology at Harvard, and Skinner believed that in a certain sense we do have a dictatorship in America, but it's not one imposed by the government. It's a dictatorship imposed by the media. that advertising and television and movies have a remarkably significant effect on people, and the influence of these industries can be quite negative as well as quite positive. So that Skinner claims that advertising and television and movies in a certain sense can indoctrinate people. Let me give an example, a rather obvious example of how an industry perhaps can indoctrinate people. We all remember the Marlboro cigarette commercials with a man on horseback. And of course, what was the aim of that commercial, of that strategy? Well, I think it's fair to say the aim was to convince, and perhaps older men as well, that smoking Marlboro cigarettes was macho, that one of the ways to enhance one's manliness was by smoking cigarettes. And I think most people would conclude this was a kind of unfortunate indoctrination or attempt at indoctrination. The other thing perhaps we should all do if we want to come to a great appreciation of what is true is to develop a habit of reality testing. Again, to develop the habit of reality testing. And what does this involve? Well, habitually ask yourself, is it possible that in addition to the media, that some of my teachers, friends, relatives, and my government have misled me about what is true? Even Jesus provided some warnings about how one's family can at least inadvertently confuse oneself. And Walt Whitman said this. Walt Whitman, the famous poet, said, "Examine all that you have been taught, and disregard all that insults your soul." And Nietzsche, a famous German philosopher, put it this way. Nietzsche said, "The surest way to corrupt a young person is to instruct him to hold in higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently." What have been some of the achievements of the skeptics, of the doubters? I think it's fair to say that society would not progress, the world would not progress, if it was not for some of the contributions of the skeptics and the doubters. Well, for many centuries, people were ruled by hereditary rulers, kings, queens, emperors, empresses. And then some people, like Thomas Jefferson, John Locke, Montesquieu, challenged that idea and claimed that the people should decide who rule them, that the government should get its consent, the government, should get its power from the consent of the government. So due to people like Jefferson and Locke and Montesquieu, today a majority of the countries in the world have democratic governments, and very few have hereditary rulers. Another example of the accomplishments of the skeptics and the doubters concerns established religions. We know that over the centuries, many countries had an official religion. In Spain, it was Catholicism. In England, it was the Anglican religion. Even the colony of Virginia, when Jefferson was alive, had an established religion. It was a Protestant sect, and one had to pay taxes to the official religion of the colony, whether or not one followed that religion. And here again, Thomas Jefferson came to the rescue, so to speak, and challenged this idea of a government having an official religion, an established religion. And due to Jefferson's efforts and the efforts of others, today Virginia, and indeed no state in the United States, nor the federal government, has an official religion. Indeed, it's not permitted by our Constitution. And so many other countries in the world have done away with their official, established religions. And of course, another example would concern the discrimination women suffered for years. People like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, skeptics like Stanton, doubters like Stanton, were responsible for challenging the idea that men should have a superior position to women in society. And the Stantons won, and fortunately, the Stantons and people like her won, so that today we are moving increasingly to a situation whereby women have equal rights with men. I think a good summing up of what I've said so far is provided by Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell said that one of the most important things we can learn in life is to think critically. Russell said many people have the wrong attitude towards education. They think that education mainly concerns facts. And Russell said no, the emphasis on education should not be learning a lot of facts, although that's important. The emphasis in education should be on developing a scientific habit of mind. Developing a scientific habit of mind, and by that he meant become a critical thinker, an independent thinker, somebody who is skeptical of the common notions of one's culture. And also, I think that psychologist Carl Rogers also provides some advice here, very helpful advice. Carl Rogers, in his terrific book entitled On Becoming a Person, says that real learning, significant learning, concerns or involves the ability to apply knowledge to everyday life. Again, Rogers claims the most significant learning we do involves learning to apply what we learn to everyday living. And let me quote psychologist Carl Rogers. I mean learning which is more than an accumulation of facts. It is learning which makes a difference in the individual's behavior, in the course of action he chooses in the future, in his attitudes and in his personality. It is a pervasive learning which is not just an accretion of knowledge. Again, it is a pervasive learning which is not just an accretion of knowledge, but which interpenetrates with every portion of his existence. If you are desirous of exploring this topic on your own, this topic of what are the most important things we can learn in life, among the recommended reading, I would suggest that perhaps you start off with The Apology by Plato. There are other books I'll be talking about in the future, but I think that's a good book to start with. It's a very short book, The Apology by Plato. As is my custom, I would like to end with a quote, my favorite quote from Henry David Thoreau, who said in Walden, "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."